13 years ago, about this time of year, our bread machine expired in a dramatic flourish. Originally, the bread maker, had been a company gift to Laurie from the holiday catalog, but we didn't use it for a long time. Between Laurie's office in Midtown Manhattan and the subway back to Queens, there was a little grocery called the Amish Market, and she would buy our bread there on the way home. When we moved to the Atlanta suburbs, there was no good bread around to buy, so we gave the bread man a chance to prove itself useful. The initial results were not good, and we blamed the bread man. The bread came out spongy and not baked through entirely, especially around the paddle, which always left an unsightly hole, and the machine was almost impossible to clean. But somehow we stumbled on a way to work together with the machine. At some point it occurred to us to let the bread man knead and handle the rising, but we would take out the dough and shape it and bake it in the oven. And the resulting bread we made with bread man was really good. Bread man. At some point that stopped being a brand, but the name we called the thing. And although we were busy with our little kids and soon a newborn, and adding any new thing to the household tasks seemed hard, we figured out how to carve out 5 minutes to get bread started, and 5 minutes an hour or two later to do the shaping, and we bake a couple of loaves every other night. The reward of that warm bread smell and a little warm slice with butter in the evening was a nice moment between us and bread man, and we felt good about ourselves for baking our own bread. In the winter of our first year in New Hampshire, bread man started making unusual noises. Usually a little more water in the dough would settle it down. We started to think about the KitchenAid mixer that was still unpacked, with its serious dough hook and a more athletic build. But we had a good thing going with Bread Man, a good routine and good results. One night, Bread Man was really noisy. This was different, and I looked over at it, and it was quivering on the counter. I put in some more water and tried to adjust the paddle and the seating of the pan and the machine, and I pushed it away from the edge of the counter where it had shivered its way too close. I turned around, and a few seconds later I heard a loud noise from the machine and then a crash. The bread man had hurled itself off the counter, yanking the power cord right out of the socket, and that was its end. I wondered if Bread Man had heard us talking about the KitchenAid mixer and decided to take matters into its own hands in a sort of "you can't fire me, I quit" manner, with some Shakespearean tragedy needed in. I think about Bread Man and what it taught me every year around this time when we consider Chametz and Matzah, as the Torah reminded us today to plan for a week without bread in our diets or even in our homes. For a while after Bread Man's demise, I was in a sort of denial that there was anything to learn. We ate differently. We tried some Hannaford bread. We'd get tortillas from Trader Joe's. It wasn't nearly as good. I remember thinking, what did the bread man really contribute to our great bread? Kneading and regulating the temperature during the rising. I could do that. The only reason the machine was doing it was because I was lazy, but surely I was capable if I wanted to. I tried kneading by hand, and I tried setting the dough next to an open, partially heated oven for rising, but I didn't have the patience and my fingers got sore quickly, and really I didn't have the skills that Bread Man had. Eventually, we did unpack the KitchenAid mixer until that stopped working, and it's been partnerships with bread makers ever since. The Alter Rebbe of Lubavitch, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, taught that fluffy bread, chametz, represents ga'ava, or pride, an inflated sense of self-importance. Flat matzah represents humility, a sense of proportion about ourselves in the world. Flour and water don't puff out, even when you mix them together. They take up more or less the same space they do separately. That's matzah. It's the yeast that comes in and puffs it up. That's chametz, when we ourselves are out of proportion, when we take up too much space in a conversation or a group, when we give ourselves too much credit for something we had a role in, when we think, this time I pulled this off together with someone, but if I wanted to, I could have done it as well on my own. Matzah flour has to be watched to make sure it doesn't have time to leaven. So too we need to watch ourselves, to make ourselves pay attention to how and when we puff up too much. which family relationships or family gatherings, which social groups or communities seem to bring out that ga'ava. It's a great Hebrew word, the word for pride. It sounds almost like a burp, ga'ava. Like when we push out our presence, but what we're offering out isn't sustainable for more than a second. We have to monitor ourselves as we process each self-harvest into flour, as we work on each loaf we're trying to bake. Even the demise of Breadman didn't get through to me about this. It took my subsequent failure as a stand-in for me to realize how much precisely I was contributing to the bread-making process. But Chametz can teach us not just about watching ourselves. Chametz teaches with much more nuance about seeing others. Here's another Rebbe, Rose Levy Birnbaum, explaining in the Bread Bible. Yeast is a living, single-cell plant. Flour is a carbohydrate. Like all carbohydrates, the starch molecules are made up of hundreds of sugar molecules. When the yeast, water, and flour are combined, enzymes in the flour break down the carbohydrates into sugar. The yeast eats this sugar, grows and multiplies, and gives off carbon dioxide and alcohol. As it is produced, the carbon dioxide is held in by a network of gluten strands, or protein, formed by kneading together the flour and the water, and it leavens, or causes the bread to rise. Both the carbon dioxide and the alcohol evaporate into the air during baking. Yeast is at the core of the Chametz Matzah distinction, and look what it goes through. Yeast is so small, and at the start these single cells are surrounded by all these enormous and complex multi-celled starches, and molecules upon molecules of water. When they all first come into contact, things start to happen, and the yeast can suddenly feed and multiply and unleash a burst of carbon dioxide, which could be just a ga'ava popping once on its own and then it's gone. But that doesn't happen as long as a person or a machine is kneading the dough to harness the yeast's elementary contribution in a back and forth with the gluten in the flour. And then the yeast is gone, and eventually the carbon dioxide too. And you don't even see them or think of them as you enjoy the magnificent loaf of fresh bread. So bread making reminds us not just to be humble, but to look in specific kinds of places that other contributors are. When bread turns out well, whether it's whole wheat sandwich bread or challah, I usually pat myself on the back for getting the proportions measured just right and the timing. And when it's wrong, I blame myself. Maybe I know to credit the machine, but there are these other contributors who are smaller than me or the machine, who take over from me for a time, or who do this dance with me. I am way more complex and powerful in the aggregate than the single-celled yeast or the carbs in the bread, but I cannot bake bread without them. They are far more focused than it's possible for me to be as a human being. They can see things that I cannot, and they fulfill their purpose with the single mind of the Creator. There are small and hidden partners everywhere. That's what the Sfat Emet of Ger teaches. Chametz and Matzah have the same Hebrew letters, except for the difference between a He and a Chet, which is a matter of a small gap left in the middle of a letter. The Chet of Chametz closes that up, takes up the whole thing, while the He leaves an awareness of something small or not obvious that is not itself. It is easiest to recognize a partner when that person is someone similar to you, in stature or power or salary or title, or when that person is always around, from looking at the recipe to measuring the ingredients all the way to serving the bread. But there are people who play the role of the yeast, the catalyst, who deserve to be in our consciousness the whole way through, even though they're not visible so much or they are featured, but only in the middle or out of sight. And we each deserve to be recognized by someone else too, when we are the yeast, or holding out the gluten strands, and not the kneader ourselves or the final bread. We have to work hard to see all the contributors and listen for all the voices, from the moment we enter a project or a complicated decision through the middle of it, all the way to its satisfying product. You may think I'm teaching the opposite of something I said a few weeks ago about the tiny letter Aleph in the first word of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, the Aleph that stands for Anochi, me, the ego, and how we're all feeling a bit shrunk and in need of reinflation so we can take our place again in the fuller world where we can walk and breathe and act. So I'm thinking that the first of the 4 questions of the Seder says that on all nights of the regular year we eat both Chametz and Matzah. That's really what we need, to eat both Chametz and Matzah, to poof out more than we have the past couple of years, and to watch ourselves, to make sure that as we re-expand into fuller beings in year 3, we watch and help each other do that too, and as need be, pull ourselves back. None of us has all the answers right now. We can't bake the bread of what this spring or summer will be like any faster than the yeast and the gluten of social life will let us, or the particles of air and the antibodies that are smaller than we, but oh so powerful. We can't shorten the time it takes to do our dance with all of these ingredients. On Purim, we made doughy hamantashen and imagined accelerating. On Pesach, we'll slow down and eat matzah for a week. Then after, it will be chametz and matzah for months and months. The moon is new, and soon it will be time to go around and search for chametz in all the rooms where we eat our meals or snacks, and to go over in our minds the conversations and projects that are specific to each of those places: the kitchen, the dining room, the car, the places we talk on the phone, the bedroom, the offices, physical or Zoomed. What am I like there? Do I notice the other needers who were with me, or the catalysts who were harder to see? Am I Puffy there, or just right? Look carefully in each place, shine a candle, sweep away the crumbs you find, and say a bracha. With our various bread machines at home, I've learned to play around with the recipes, to measure more carefully and watch the time, to add or take away a little bit to make the bread healthier. That's been my part, and I've come to do it well. Breadman looked so simple, but it did its jobs of kneading and temperature control so much better than I could. We deserve to take credit every time we make great bread, and we should never be so haughty as to think we do it alone.